So good morning. My name is Tim de Boeck. I'm a solutions architect for customer success at Palo Alto Networks. And in this session, we're going to be talking a little bit about how to use best practices to prevent successful cyber attacks. Now, a little bit of history, on the customer success team. First of all, this is a fairly new team within Palo Alto Networks. It was started about, let's say, 3 years ago in the US and about 1.5 years ago in EMEA. And so our mission or our goal is actually to help our customers maximize the value of their investment in our technology. That's what we started with. And this was because customers were coming to us and they were actually asking us for help on how they could optimize their security strategy, how they could optimize their prevention posture. They wanted to know, what they were using, if they could get a better visibility on what they were using of our technology, if they were using it, according to our best practices. Best practices is a theme that comes up very often. But how do you define best practices? How do you implement best practices? And another question maybe very relevant is, do we have everybody in the company aligned to basically discuss a prevention-oriented strategy? And by everybody we mean, do we have the CISO? Do we have the network operations team? Do we have a security operations team? Everybody at the table and basically agreeing to what needs to be done to improve a prevention posture. So we basically gave this a thought and we came up with a methodology and some tools to actually help drive these prevention-based outcomes. So the methodology itself is a 5-step approach. I'm pretty sure that you've seen many of these slides. But what is very important for us is that we created this methodology to actually help you drive those prevention-based outcomes. And we also build the tools around it to help you understand your network better in the first place, and also to help you implement those changes. So the first phase of this methodology focuses on assessing your network, making sure you understand what capabilities you have in place at each area of architecture in the network. And we basically do this through a prevention posture assessment. So far we've engaged with a number of our top clients already, and we've driven this prevention posture assessment from our customer success team. Now obviously, when we scale this out to everybody, both the partners and the SCs will play an important role in conducting these type of assessments as well. Now, in order to conduct the assessment, we created a tool, which is the prevention posture assessment tool, which I'll come to in a few minutes, going through the details of what it actually is. But the whole idea is to have a conversation around security architecture, to help customers understand what their current posture is, where the gaps lie, and how they can actually close those gaps, right? The second part is where we actually take a closer look at the firewalls you've deployed in your environment. So where we, in the assessment phase, we really focus on any type of capability that is required. In the analyze phase, we focus specifically on our technology, right? And we really take a closer look at the configuration of your firewalls. And to that end, we've developed another tool, which is called the Best Practice Assessment Tool, which gives us really detailed insights in how you're configuring your firewall and how you're using the technology, right? Now, once we've gone through the assessment and the analysis phase, obviously, we come back to the customer with our findings and recommendations. And we present them with the gaps that we found, or let's say incomplete configurations, inconsistencies in the configuration. And together we develop an adoption plan. And the goal, of course, is then to implement that adoption plan, to kind of agree on a set of next steps, to agree on a timeline, to make sure that everybody's aligned on what the requirements are to help implement the plan. So that could be, for example, relying on professional services or partner services to get certain things implemented, the more complex tasks, for example. It may include additional kit, so maybe deploying additional firewalls or additional technologies in your network to help close certain gaps. And then, of course, we also make sure that the execution goes, according to that timeline, according to that plan. Here we have another tool that can assist, which is Expedition, or the migration tool, which you may or may not be familiar with, because this tool has been around for many years and is also available to customers. Talk a little bit more about what we did with Expedition, from a customer success perspective, from a best practice perspective, also later on. And then, of course, finally, when we talk about closing the whole loop, it comes down to demonstrating operational confidence. So making sure that you can actually show that everything you've implemented, all the changes that you made, are actually bringing you some positive outcomes, right? That they close certain gaps, and to that end, you need solid reporting. Okay, you need reporting on the threats that you're seeing across your architecture. But for example, also very interesting is trending data that shows you how you're evolving, how you're improving your security posture through this methodology. So that's kind of what we put together as a workflow. And this is something that we've done already with a number of customers to kind of try this out, to figure out if it would work, yes or no. And so what we're going to do in the next couple of minutes and slides is actually go a little bit deeper into the different phases and the different tools, and I'll share you some takeaways that we had with these customers, these initial customers. So the first part, as I mentioned, is the prevention posture assessment. So this is where we actually go in and do a vendor agnostic assessment of a customer's environment. It's based around a survey, so it's a questionnaire that focuses on the different stages of the cyber attack lifecycle. And the whole idea of this assessment is actually to get everybody who's involved in securing an organization into the same room, to have a discussion with all the stakeholders, to kind of see if they're aligned and if they are basically aware of what capabilities are deployed and how they're being used, etc. The output of the tool itself is a report that we then share with the customer, which contains our findings and also detailed recommendations and next steps. Now, I'd like to go through two examples of what we've seen during these assessments. The first one is so this is actually from an existing customer. We won't give you any names, of course, but very interesting for this posture is that it's kind of what we saw with most of our customers, right? So it's kind of a good representation of the state of most of the customers that we've done this assessment with. And I'll give you some time to take in the graph itself, but let me quickly explain what we show here. So as I said, we conduct the assessment according to the different stages of the cyber attack lifecycle. So the first 5 bars that you see, from delivery, command and control, privileged operations, exfiltration, and exploitation, they represent the stages of a cyber attack lifecycle. The last 3 bars focus on operational posture, which is also important. It ties around how you manage your equipment, how you manage your firewalls. And what you can see from this graph is that the first 2 bars are fairly okay. You can definitely see that both for delivery and command and control, there are certain controls, certain capabilities in place. So the stuff that is, or the parts that are green, actually mean that the capabilities that we are looking for are in place and are configured, as we would recommend you to configure them. The parts in yellow or orange mean that there are capabilities in place, but they are not properly configured or incomplete, let's say. And the ones in red, it actually means that there is nothing, there's no capabilities, or there's not what we are looking for, right? So what is the takeaway here? If you look at delivery and command and control, definitely capabilities in place, maybe not all of them properly configured, but at least that's what we see with a lot of customers. It means at the perimeter they have done, or they have implemented certain things that will prevent bad stuff from coming in. But then again, if you look at the next part here, the next stage in the attack life cycle, where we look at lateral movement internally, in this case it was completely red. So it means this customer does not have internal segmentation in their network. It means that users can actually just reach out to any server system. They can have direct access to, for example, domain controllers, mail systems, any server type of equipment in the environment is basically open to any end user. So there's no network-based controls in place there. And the same for the exfiltration stage, which focuses on the data center, where we see that for on-premise data centers or for workloads that have been moved to Azure or any other type of EAS environment, or even SaaS-based applications, you see that there's a huge gap in how those resources, in how those workloads and applications are being protected. And then finally, exploitation focuses on the endpoint, how the endpoint itself is protected. And here as well, we see that with many customers, there is still a huge gap in terms of endpoint protection. So most customers still rely on legacy antivirus programs to protect their endpoints, where today, the state of security demands that you look for, more next generation capabilities, more advanced endpoint protection controls. So this was an interesting one to kind of show you this is what we see with many customers. And a few things come out here as well, in addition to what I've told you, is that when we look at all the capabilities that are implemented, there's always like a number of capabilities that come back with each customer that they've never looked at, that they've never actually investigated or touched on or implemented in a certain way. The first one is what I already mentioned, is layer 7 segmentation. And so most customers only have that layer 7 segmentation, or let's say for that matter, any segmentation at all at the perimeter. If you look inside the network, it's typically wide open, or at least there's nothing running in blocking mode. The second one here is also a bit of a surprise. If you look at mobile users, so people who actually regularly work from home or remote, but often come into the office maybe 1 or 2 days a week, then you see those types of users are not properly protected with an always-on full tunnel VPN. And why is that important? Well, if you don't have an always-on full tunnel VPN, it means that the posture of those users, it changes as they move around. So they will be better protected when they're inside the company, but when they go out, all of a sudden they can do a lot more. They can get more easily infected and bring bad stuff into the network as they physically plug themselves into the internal network. Decryption of SSL traffic, another big one. Funny enough, currently a lot of customers, or most of the customers, are still not decrypting SSL traffic. The last customer I spoke to, and we'll come to that in the next slide, the last customer I spoke to was investigating it, and they said they are currently seeing about 70% of all internet-bound traffic is being encrypted in SSL. So that means you're blind to 70% of what's coming into your network. But funny enough, most customers are still not decrypting SSL traffic. Network-based user access control, and again, this ties into the internal part of the network as well as your perimeter. Network-based user access control is often absent, so again, it's a control that is not there, which makes it again easier for a hacker, once he's inside the network, to move laterally from one system to another system. But again, yeah, something that is very often missing. And then the last one is kind of to sum up all the public cloud environments that customers are moving to, whether that's Azure or AWS or Google Cloud or any type of SaaS application. We see a big discrepancy between how they're protecting data that is inside their network versus data that is outside, that is in a cloud application. Often there is like a big gap as well in their posture. So these are kind of the key takeaways for us from the assessments that we've done with some of our top customers. Like I said, this was an average picture, or this gave you the average state that most customers have. This one is actually one that we did recently, and as you can already see from the graph, it looks much better, right? So these guys, they actually had a good grip on their overall security posture. They had full layer 7 segmentation in their network, and they actually had the controls in place at each of these transition points. So we're talking, for example, about things like vulnerability protection. They ran it across the board, right? Every part of their network was actually protected by vulnerability protection. Same for Wildfire, antivirus. Of course, there are areas that need improvement in terms of configuration, but as you can see, things look a lot better here. Now, interestingly, when we looked at these 5 capabilities that we most often see not implemented, they were also not there yet. So it seems to be that these 5 capabilities are somehow the most difficult to tackle, the most challenging to tackle, or maybe some people don't see the value and say, okay, why do we need it? That's why, an assessment like this is really interesting, because then you can actually point out, why do you need it, what's the benefit, etc. But the interesting thing was that when we conducted this assessment, they actually had most of these things planned in the near-term roadmap. So they were going to implement them in the next year or so. So that was the interesting takeaway for us as well. So we know there are customers that, even without our involvement and without our advice, they are actually taking their security up to the next level, right? They're actively working on it. They're proactively working on this. The only thing that we identified here was, again, the public cloud posture. There seemed to be a misunderstanding between the network team, the endpoint team, and the cloud security team about what exactly was in place and how it was being used. So they were not exactly aligned on that level, but that was, a takeaway for them to kind of, come together and discuss their current public cloud posture. So that's kind of what the prevention posture assessment learns or tells us, and that's kind of the findings that we bring back to our customers that we want to share with everybody. Now, the next part, where we actually go and take a look at the actual firewall configuration, is what we call the best practice assessment. And in order to do that, in order to make it easier for us to do that at scale, we've created a tool which is called the best practice assessment tool for the next generation firewall and Panorama. And this tool takes a tech support file. It basically analyzes the configuration inside that tech support file, and it will create an HTML report based on the information we find in there. And that HTML report it's a more technical report. It's typically oriented towards security operations people, maybe security architects. But there's 3 things that we can take out of the report that will tell you how your firewalls are configured. One is a heat maps component, which tells you capability adoption across all your rules. The second one is a best practice part, which actually looks at how you're configuring certain capabilities, how you're configuring your rules, etc. And the last part is the trending view. And I'm going to go into each of these with a couple of examples to help you kind of understand, what the value is of these 3 components. So the first example is around security profile adoption. And so if you know our firewalls, with security profiles, we talk about Wildfire, we talk about vulnerability protection, we talk about anti-spyware, antivirus. And so the heat map functionality or the heat map views, this is what you see on the screen here, they actually give you an overview of how you're using these capabilities across your rule base. Now, the view that you see here is from a device group perspective. There's other types of perspectives that you can have as well, from a source destination zone perspective, for example, or from an area of architecture perspective. But here you get it from a device group perspective. And in this example, you can see, for example, there's certain areas of the network that are well protected, that have good adoption of these security profiles, like, for example, the data center areas, the perimeter area. But then, for example, as you move to branch offices or cloud firewalls, you see that things are a little bit more empty. And this is exactly what we want to show with these heat maps, is to give you a quick overview of how you're doing in terms of capability adoption. Now, the other part here, obviously, that is very important, besides making sure that you have consistently high numbers in this view, is to also make sure that logging is enabled. So at the end of the chart here, you see there's a column on logging, how much logging is enabled for all the rules. And that's another part where we say, okay, this is really important that you turn that on. If you don't have visibility, you don't know what's happening in the network from a threat perspective. Okay. So that's one example of what this best practice assessment report can tell you. This is the heat map view. Now, obviously, what the heat map view does not tell you is how each of these capabilities are exactly configured. It shows you where they're used, but you don't know, for example, is my antivirus profile configured according to the best practices that we would recommend. That's the second part of the tool, of the report. It shows you in very much detail how your profiles are configured and if they are matching our best practice recommendations or not. So here you see an example of an antivirus profile. Again, this is a very common example that we see across our customer installations. What pops out here is that if you look at the antivirus configuration, there is two types of actions that you can set. So there's the standard action for regular virus signatures, which is in this case mostly set to reset both. So it aligns to our best practices. But then the second column where you have the wildfire action, which basically triggers when a wildfire signature is hit. In this case, it's set to alert. And so you see at the bottom here that one of the checks that we are doing for the antivirus profile is failing, and that's because of that reason. So this particular check is failing because wildfire action shouldn't be set to alert, right? We see this with a lot of customers. We don't know why exactly. In most cases, they tell us, oh, but we wanted to try it out 3 years ago, so we set it to alert. We wanted to be careful, which is perfectly fine. But they never actually bothered or went back into their configuration to change it to a reset. Sure, can we?
Which the tools do you use to figure out these results? Which is the tools analyze?
This is the tool that we're discussing. So this is the report that you will generate through the tool. And this is a report that you will get if you upload a tech support file into the tool. This is the output of the analysis, let's say. I'll clarify that later on. Actually, we have a booth where we can show you more in detail how you generate one. Now, I'll come back to availability and what it means for customers when it's available for customers. If you just bear with me for a second, I'll go through the examples first, and then I'll explain how you can get to this. So this is a very common example, and it's only in most cases it's like something that just is people have forgotten about it and they've been running it, but they're not actually getting the full value out of Wildfire. So they're sending off files for analysis to Wildfire. They're getting signatures back for unknown malicious files, but eventually they're not blocking them, right? Very simple, very easy to fix. Doesn't create a lot of impact because Wildfire is typically not prone to a large false positive rate. So very easy to fix, but you need to find it, you need to come to it, and that's what the report shows you. Another common example on network defense is zone protection. Again, something that we very often see with customers. When they apply zone protection, they typically only apply it to the outside zones of their firewalls, right? Because they argue, okay, if we look at, for example, flooding attacks, they typically come from the internet. That's what everybody thinks. Now, we do have quite a few customers who accidentally DDoS themselves. And I say accidentally because it's usually originating from somewhere in the network. For an unknown cause, all of a sudden, all of your end users start doing something, or the end client systems start doing something, and they just overload the firewall with new sessions per second, and you DDoS yourself, right? So that's why we recommend to enable zone protection on all your zones, internal and external. That's our first recommendation. And then also to make sure that that zone protection profile is properly configured. Because that's the second thing that we see. When customers turn this on, they don't look at the actual threshold values that decide when the protection will kick in. They just rely on the default values that we provide them. But the default values are not applicable to just every environment. It's not that those default values will help for every customer. You need to profile your network, and then you need to make sure that the thresholds actually apply to the volumes of traffic that are seen in your network. So that's another check that we do is make sure that when it's turned on that you're not using the default values. So those are just a couple of examples. The tool itself has over 200 checks. So we cannot go into every individual check, of course, but when you get access to the tool, you'll see how deep it goes into analyzing your configuration. Now, the end goal, of course, here is that you start making those changes, and obviously, when we look at measuring your progress, that you can also demonstrate that you're improving the configuration of your firewall. And so that's the last view that we included in this report, is a trending view, where we actually show you over time, every time you generate a new report, we show you over time, how you're improving your configuration. So here you see over the course of 1 year, you kind of see that in this config, a lot of capabilities went from, practically no adoption to a very good state. As you can see on the last column, there is a comparison to the industry, to your specific industry. So you see how you're doing compared to other companies in your vertical. And we do that for capability adoption. We give you a trending view for capability adoption, but we also give you a trending view for the actual best practice configuration. So you can see, when you're changing profiles, you see that object score going up, but the same checks exist for policies, for network config, for device config, and for panorama config. So really interesting. Now, to come back to the earlier question, do you have access to this tool? Currently, the tool is available to partners and our system engineers. So if you're interested, you can already reach out to them, and they will basically generate the report for you. But the tool will become available to customers by mid-November of this year. So if you're not in a hurry, you can wait another month, and then you will be able to access the tool through the support portal. And all it takes is a tech support file. You upload it. We will generate the report, give it back to you in a password-protected zip file, and you're good to go. Okay. So this covers the second part, where you actually analyze your configuration and look for gaps in that configuration. Then you go into defining an action plan and executing on the action plan. And so obviously here, this is where a lot of the work needs to be done. To that end, we have a tool that was formerly called the migration tool. It is now called Expedition. I'm not sure if many people are aware of this tool. It's been available to customers for a couple of years at least. But a lot of our professional service engineers use this tool. A lot of our partners use this tool to basically, first of all, migrate a configuration. And now, secondly, most importantly, with Expedition, you can now also move your firewall configuration to the next level. There's a lot of enhancements that allow you to do things like, for example, app ID or user ID adoption, or to make sure that your security profiles are correctly configured. Now, what we brought to the table here for this particular tool is our library of best practices. So we provided our set of best practices to the developers of this tool. They included it as well, and so when you load a configuration into this tool, you can run the same type of best practice assessment and show basically all the gaps in your firewall configuration inside this tool. So it becomes very easy to start remediating them from inside this tool. One example here is for one customer that was doing a perimeter revamp project. They had been using our firewalls for many years already, but they were not using all the capabilities. And so after we did an assessment with them, they actually leveraged Expedition to move their firewalls to the next level and to start basically adopting all the additional capabilities on the firewall. But a tool like Expedition makes it easier to do because you can mass edit your configuration, your existing configuration, and, for example, apply profiles to large sets of rules. Okay. And then finally, of course, there is a reporting functionality. Again, this is something you will probably be aware of if you're using our firewalls. So there's a lot of custom reports, there's a lot of built-in reports, and then there's also the security lifecycle review report, which gives you a good overview of the types of traffic, the types of applications, the types of threats you are seeing on your network. And these reports can actually be used again also to measure progress, but now from a real logging perspective, from the data that is gathered by the firewall. And so typically as you run these reports together with the BPA report, you will see changes into the types of applications, the types of threats that you will see, the volumes, etc. So again, this is very useful in measuring the effectiveness of those changes. So a couple of examples here about what you can find, for example, in the security lifecycle review. The first view here is a good look at your applications. So what are the top applications used in your organization? You can filter them by application category, for example. You can also get a good understanding of who are the top users, for example, of certain applications. And you can use this to further fine-tune your application policy, right? If there's things in here that you absolutely do not want on your network, you can just rule them out in the policy, but use this as a source. Another interesting view on applications is SaaS-based applications. So here we kind of look at the risk an application brings due to the type of application or the terms of service for that application. Certain SaaS applications do not actually give you a guarantee that they will not reuse your data, for example. The data that you give them, they can sell it to other parties, for example, and that's what we try to give you here is kind of an understanding of what applications bring you additional risk by using them. So again, you can tune your application policy based on what you see in the report. And then, of course, there's the regular information around URL categories being used, the ones that generate a lot of traffic, the ones that maybe should not be in there, like malware and phishing categories. And finally, you also get a good overview of the types of threats that you're seeing. So we talk here about vulnerability exploits. We talk about known malware versus unknown malware. We talk about command and control, the volumes that are seen. And then finally, obviously, the observations that we take away from the whole assessment is, first of all, bringing people together is very effective in first of all, driving collaboration, of course, but making sure that everybody's aligned to the prevention outcomes that you want to drive. So when you do that assessment type of engagement, we want to make sure that everybody that is involved in security is part of that exercise. Second takeaway for us is there are a lot of capabilities that are what we consider low-hanging fruit, which means they are fairly easy to implement without major impact, without major project requirements, but they do significantly increase your posture, your security posture. We looked at wildfire signatures, for example. Just moving them from alert to a block posture really gives you an immediate benefit. It doesn't require a lot of effort, easy to implement. So don't think everything here is project-based and requires a lot of resources. And then obviously, being able to show progress to your leadership also helps you build confidence, right? If you can see what you're doing and if you can see what positive progress you're making, if you can show that, that also gives confidence in the entire team, right? And the last part here, if you can then also correlate whatever log data you have, whatever threat data you have from the logs, if you can correlate that to the efforts you're doing, that also gives you a nice idea of the progress you're making and if it makes any impact. Okay, now there's a lot more about this, of course, about this methodology. So if you want to know more, first of all, you can visit our website. There's a landing page on the prevention architecture methodology. The different tools that I discussed, like I said, some of them are already available, like the SLR tool is available to customers already through the support portal. Expedition is available through the live community. The BPA report will be available in a month from now, but if you're in a hurry, you can already ask your SE or your partner to generate your report to get a first view. And for the PPA, you will still have to go through your SE or through your partner. They can help you run the type of assessment, and they can actually help you, to get a better view of your security architecture and your security posture. So before we go into any further questions, I think by now everybody's aware of the contest that we're having here, so I just want to point you to that. I also want to mention that we have a booth, so the customer success booth around best practices is also in the main expo hall, just opposite the network security, endpoint security booths. So if you want more details, feel free to hop by. We'll be there all day. But right now, I'll open it up for questions. If anybody has any additional questions, feel free to ask. Then I guess no questions. Everything was crystal clear. All right, and I'd say thank you for coming in this early. I see the audience has doubled while we were going through the session, so that's also a good thing. And I would say, yeah, enjoy the last day of Ignite and maybe the last day of Amsterdam. I don't know. But thank you. Bye.